Bible study, but last Wednesday night we covered some things, but we've got a lot more to go to today. So we've got to see for sure where we're going to start here. 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 23 is where we're going to start. When Paul wrote to these brethren, he was covering about a lot of different things that they needed to understand, and he kind of figured out these people there in that church at Corinth were primarily Gentiles, and so a lot of these things they wouldn't understand. We've got a lot of people in our world today, our country today, that don't understand something like this, the Lord's Supper, the frequency of it and how to take it and the purpose of it and all those sorts of things. So Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 11 and 16, or actually verse 17, he says, "But in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you've come together not for the better, but for the worst." And so we talked about that, but I want to cover it just a little bit so we'll all be on the same page. He first starts talking about the divisions and so forth, and I'm not going to cover all of that, but the reason why he's doing that, the most solemn thing that we do on the Lord's Day when we meet to worship is to take the Lord's Supper. And you know, I've all the years I've been in the church, I've seen places where there were contentions and divisions and bad attitudes and all that sort of thing. And so Paul was dealing with this. He wanted these people to understand the importance of this and that right attitude and why that they were doing it. And he said that I hear that there are divisions among you there in verse 17 or 18 rather. And so he said there's also factions. And so when he gets down to the 20th verse, he said, "Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper." And that sounds kind of strange when you read that. You think, well, I thought that's why we came, you know. And another thing that we talked about last Wednesday was in that verse 17. He said, when you come together as a church, it's what he was talking. Yeah, in the latter part of it, come together as a church. And I years ago, I was went down to Troy's to visit him and went to church with him one Sunday morning, and I had some questions about some things that I would like to talk to somebody about, some scriptural things, and so I got to talk to his preacher, Dan Jenkins, who's a great guy. And so Dan pointed this verse out to me, and it really cleared some things up. And so when Paul is writing to these people, he talks to them because they're the church, and it's not a building, it's not an individual, it's the assembly, the entire corporate group. So when he starts there and talking about that Lord's Supper, he says that there can be severe judgments on the idolatrous Israelites, and I mentioned this last Wednesday night. I read somewhere where someone said, "We serve what we worship." And I thought how true that is. And it's not necessarily talking about church. Yeah. It can be other things. But whatever is the most important to you in your life, that's what you focus on. Those of us that have families, we focus on our families, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, or whatever it is. And Friday evening, when Sherry and I went down to see my cousin, went down to the show down there, and I met with one of my cousins, and I hadn't seen her in some time, and really enjoyed getting to be with her and her friend. But we were talking about families and so forth, and as I think about that, as I think how that we need to treat one another, God wants us to, if we come together and we don't have the right attitude, then the Lord's Supper is meaningless. So as he talked to the Israelites, and when I said something about we serve what we worship, I was thinking about that also. She made some comments about my family, and my family was quite unique. Daddy had 9 8 siblings, and there were 4 boys. And she said, something very complimentary about the Spradlin men. And I thought, I wouldn't even think about that. But people notice. They notice how you act and how you talk and what you do. And so I really like that. Then whenever Paul gets into the depth about the Lord's Supper, starting there in verse 23, one of the things that we do when we take the Lord's Supper is we drink the fruit of the vine. And so when Paul is writing to these brethren, he talks about in verse 26, you eat this bread and you drink this cup. In Matthew, he called it the cup of blessing. Matthew 26 and verse 27. And the word blessing, it just simply means thanks. When we go out to eat, I don't care where we are, I don't care, who's around, I'm going to pray for the meal. Ask God to bless it. And if someone gets offended, then they'll just have to be offended, because that's my right and my privilege, and I'm going to do it. And I don't do it out loud, wherever everybody in the whole restaurant, but talking just like I'm talking right now. Well, that cup of blessing that Jesus is talking, or Paul is talking about rather right here, when we remember what the Lord did for us there on Calvary, we're blessed by what he did. And it doesn't just, I think sometimes people think, okay, I've been forgiven and I'm so thankful for that. But that imposes some responsibilities on us. Everywhere we go, it doesn't make any difference where you're at, whether you're at work, whether you're at a restaurant, whether you're buying groceries, or wherever you are, we represent the Lord. And we have to remember that. And I have to constantly remind myself of that, because in our world today, there's so many opportunities for us to get a little perturbed at the way people act and think and talk. We went to the store the other day and some other places, and we were talking about, well, in fact, at Granbury, they were having a basketball tournament, or I guess that's what it was, and there were buses from everywhere, and we saw some of these young ladies, and it was disgusting. It was disgusting. If that would have been my daughter, I would have said, you go home and you put some clothes on. It's so sickening. And I'm sure that some of those girls went to church. I'm sure that some of them have a relationship with God. But if they don't represent him properly, then they bring disgrace upon him, and I don't like that. And so, when you read these words here about how that Jesus took the cup there in Matthew, a lot of confusion has been created also over those words. He told them to drink ye all of it. It says he took the cup and blessed the cup. And I mentioned there the other night that I've been in places before where they thought, okay, that means singular cup. You can only have one cup at the Lord's Supper. And, I really don't have a problem if someone wants to believe that. That's not what I think it means. I don't think it's talking about the physical cup. I think it's talking about the contents. But I told you years ago, we went over to a little church there in Woodson, and when we lived in Graham, this was many years ago. And so when we got there and walked in, my wife looked at the table that was set up, and they had one cup. And she whispered in my ear, no, she didn't. She spoke out loud. She said, we're sitting up front. And that really bothered her to have to drink after someone else, And I said, well, that's really not something I want to do either. But he wasn't talking about the cup. He's talking about the contents, and we have to understand that. And when he said, drink ye all of it, again, I talked about this the other evening. When you drink all of it, if my mother set some medicine or something down there in front of me, or some water, whatever, and she said, you need to drink all of it, well, I would drink all of it. Well, that wasn't what the meaning of it was. You drink a portion of it. And so, again, people, they get confused about the language, and the bottom line to it is, and Lance has said this so many times, and I fully agree with him, the best commentary on the Bible is the Bible itself. And you can go back and you can read about how they did these things, and you can ascertain exactly what God meant with these scriptures if you really want to. Another thing that I've seen problems with, and I'm going to go ahead and read these verses, all these verses, and we'll hit that one. He said, I received from the Lord, and And so Paul is telling us that this came from God himself, not from some man. That which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. And when we were in Israel, and we would go to restaurants, and sometimes we were out in the country and we'd go to just little smaller places, but there in the hotels they had large places to eat. We didn't sit down and expect the waiter to bring us some rolls, because they don't eat those. They have unleavened bread, and I thought that was interesting, how that even if you're not a practicing Jew or whatever, you still eat the same thing. I didn't like it very well. It wasn't very tasty, and I don't really prefer to have something else besides crackers, with my meal. But that was their practice, and that was the reason, is because of the leavening. And so, as Paul tells them to do that, they become one with God, he says, and I like that. And then there in verse 18, there was another verse that I wanted to look at. Let's see if I can find. When you come together as a church, there was another verse. I don't see it, but he talked about the altar, and that was the point that I wanted to make. The altar in the churches in the world today, they'll have altars. The denominational churches will. When I was a kid, and told you before, but when I guess I was probably 10 or 11, something like that. We lived down in Belton, and my mother and dad were not Christians. I wasn't raised in the church, and so they insisted that my sister and I go to church. They didn't. My younger brother didn't, but my sister and I had to go. And they picked the church, and so they picked an Episcopal church. I have no idea to this day even what they really practice or anything, other than the fact that they had an altar up front, and when you took the Lord's Supper, which was once a month, you would file up to the front, and the priest would be standing up there, and he would give you, take a wafer and put it on your tongue for you. I wouldn't do that today for the life of me. And we didn't drink the fruit of the vine, he did. So it was weird. But I think about that, and so when I read these things like this, I know that there's so much misunderstanding, and it's all so simple. And the example was given with the disciples when they shared in the Lord's Supper for the first time. So whenever we talk about the altar, he's talking, in my mind, he's talking about just appearing before God, the altar being representative of appearing before God. The words that are so important to me began there in verse 27. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. And of course, again, there's so much confusion. Back in Paul's day, from what I've read and from the different commentaries and historical things, the people that weren't Christians, they heard that, well, they were eating, the body. And they literally, they thought that these people called Christians were cannibals. And that was the misunderstanding that they had. And so I thought, it's simple if you read the scriptures. If you just read just a verse or two, you would think that. But if you went back and read what Jesus was saying, and there's some religious groups also that believe that bread becomes the literal body of Jesus whenever you partake of it. That's not the purpose for taking the Lord's Supper. It's all what we say on that table there, to remember that death. And so it doesn't become the physical literal body of Jesus. We understand that. But every time we take the Lord's Supper, we should be thinking about that sacrifice that he made. And I can't comprehend the terrible pain. It wasn't just the physical pain either, I don't think, with Jesus. I've got a brother-in-law that was in Vietnam, was 18 years old, was killed, and that's a very horrible thing for that family. You know, we think about all those things like that. But when Jesus went to the cross, and I don't think that people really can grasp the idea of him being a full-grown man, have never sinned a single time in his life. Perfect. Perfect. And yet he goes to that cross and dies for us. And so he says, which is broken for me. Someone told me one time, in fact it was here. We were talking about the Lord's Supper, and the person said, you can't say when you pray the broken body of Jesus, because not a bone was broken. I've got the scripture written down. I'll come to it in a moment. If I don't find it, someone else will for me. But the Bible calls it, when the body was broken, James will find it for me. It's in the scriptures. And so I thought about that day when that man brought that up. I said, well, I think the Bible does call it the broken body, but it's not a point that we need to, belabor. Whenever he was on that cross, his body was whole. There wasn't bone broken. I understand that. But when you have something horrible happen to you in your family, have you ever used the word "I'm just broken" over this, because the pain, the sorrow, the hurt? We all have been through those types of things. And so when we talk about Jesus' broken body, there's nothing wrong with using those terms as far as I'm concerned. Something else that we talked about too was Paul used the word tradition, and he said, he delivered traditions to the people, and so that again sometimes is an issue with people. They'll say, well, we're not supposed to be following traditions and so on and so on. What Paul was saying is, I delivered to you what the Lord gave to me. I've told you everything that the Lord told me. These are the commandments that God has given to us. Jesus said that we're supposed to remember his death and never come again. We have the command to do that. We have the example as to when they do that or did that. And that's always been an issue with people too. They'll say, well, we don't take the Lord's Supper every Sunday, because if we do, it'll become meaningless. And I've said this so many times. Why isn't that the case with them taking the offering? Does that become meaningless when they do it every Sunday? When every church I know of takes the offering every Sunday. So Paul was wanting these people to get to the real heart of the matter, not just get off the subject and begin to look at things that really they didn't need to be looking at. And that examining yourself there in chapter 11, verse 27, most people, verse 28 it is, most people don't really want to examine themselves too closely. In our world today, I was talking to one of my cousins yesterday, and I don't know that I've ever lived in a time in history, and I've lived in a few years, where there was as much pride. And I'm not talking about the type of pride where we take pride in the fact that we're a Christian, that type of thing. That boastful pride the Bible talks about. I've never seen it like it is today. It really troubles me, because when I think about Jesus, and I think The Chosen does a good job of depicting this, he was an humble man. He didn't go around bragging and boasting, and well, I came from heaven and I'm God's son and all. He came and he lived the life, and he showed us how to live. He was a man that truly would be representative of what God wanted us to be. And so when he says examine yourself, I think we all need to do that. And I don't really enjoy too much examining myself when I take everything else out of the picture. And it doesn't do any good for me to say, well, I'm just as good as everybody else, or I'm better than everybody. That doesn't work. We have to look at our actions, our thoughts, the way that other people perceive us, what they think when they see us. Do we represent Christ? Do they see what God wants them to be? And so Paul tells you, when you partake of that Lord's Supper, you better think about those things, because he says in verse 29, for he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself. Now, he says, because they're not discerning the Lord's body. I hear this all the time, and you do too. Well, you can't judge people. If you went to a trial, and you went through the trial, and the jury had passed judgment on you, and you went on and said, well, people can't pass judgment. Well, they just did. Well, in essence, it's the same type of thought. Jesus, he said, or Paul says, that this is what God has delivered to him. When we eat and drink in an unworthy manner, when we don't represent Christ and God like we should, then we're bringing judgment on ourselves. And it's not the fact that it's something that's prejudiced or biased. I thought about this so many times. If you can picture in your mind standing beside Jesus, literally, physically, and people would know who he was and what he was, and here you are, we never measure up. We're always going to fall short. I think about my dad. I say he wasn't a Christian, but he was the most perfect example of being a good person without God, without Christ. And I realize that there's some differences there. But he gave me an example as how to live as a man, how to treat my wife, how to treat other people, how to work hard, to not lie, and all these types of things. He was my example. Well, when I compare myself to him, I fall short. When I compare myself to Jesus, I'm on my knees. And we better be. We better be. Did you find that verse?
Yes, we're in it.
Okay, 1 Corinthians.
1 Corinthians 11:24. That's
24, that I just looked over. Thank you.
That's
Yeah, I
the
thought it
place
was.
it is
Thank you.
written.
Yeah. I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, the Lord Jesus on the same night in which he took bread. And when he given thanks, he broke it. He said, take eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. I just looked over. Thank you, James.
A lot of different manuscripts, versions, they leave that broken out.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that we talked a little bit about with some of the folks here. There today, the devil's always busy. And today, one of the things, the tools that he's using is trying to convince people, well, that wasn't in the original manuscript, or I've got to use this Bible, or I've got to use that Bible. And Lance has taught it, and I've taught it, and I'll continue to teach it. When you pick a Bible, find one that's a literal, word-for-word translation from the manuscripts. Now, sometimes it's kind of like translating from another language. Troy, my oldest son, he is very fluent in Spanish because he went to Paraguay, so there was a missionary down there for 7 years, so we had to learn the language. But he'll tell you that sometimes we don't have an English word that matches the Spanish word. Well, they would run into that, I'm sure, when they did these translations, but the word that they used was the best word that they had. So it doesn't hurt to go to a commentary or go to a dictionary. I've got a interlinear, goes from the Greek to the English Bible in my library. I use that. But sometimes it's the word, you can't find the exact word. But in this case here, broken is the right word. That's the correct word. And I think that what we understand that Jesus, he just literally, his body was totally consumed as he made that sacrifice for us. Not literally, physically, but we understand what he means. And I don't think there's any reason for us to ever overlook that. Then another thing that I wanted to look at, when Paul tells them to examine themselves, he gets into something else. In verse 33, he says, therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat. And this was something that they did, and again, you read historical books and things like this. I wasn't there. I don't know literally, but I think that they're correct. You can imagine that this family comes from this direction. They're all not living right side by side. They come from various places. They don't have automobiles. They're walking, and so they don't have 920 Cafe or Dos Hermanos or whatever close by to go eat, so they bring their food. And again, I can't find this in the scriptures, and so I'm going to make certain we understand that. But again, the historians say that the practice that they maintained was that they would bring their meal, they would have their meal, they would set aside a part of that, the bread and the wine, and they would use that for the Lord's Supper. And that makes sense to me. I'm not going to say that that's absolutely the way it was, but it makes sense to me. So as Paul is explaining these things to them, he says, for this reason, many are sick. Well, I'm going to go past that and I'll come back to it. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, well, they did eat a meal, and they called it the agape, which is a word that means love feast. And it wasn't, something that people from the world would look at and come up with something dirty. It was just simply what we do on the first Sunday. We sit down at the tables together. We all bring food. We share it. We enjoy being with one another. Christians should enjoy one another's company. We laugh. We cry. We pray. We do all those things together because that's what Christians do. But then they would, after they got through, they would take the Lord's Supper with a portion of the bread and the fruit of the vine. So Paul says, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. Well, I think the eating that he's talking about here probably was the common meal. It could also be the Lord's Supper, but I think it was a common meal. But basically what he's saying is, okay, you know, in any congregation, I can tell you in this congregation, when it gets about 10:55, somebody will come in. When it gets 11:05, somebody might come in. Because we don't all operate the same way. And so Paul's saying, just don't get in a rush. Just take your time. And he says, and then you can share together. And that could be the Lord's Supper. It could be the common meal. I don't care which way it is. It's just all talking about attitude. But he said, and another thing, he said, for this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. And for years I would read that, and I would think there's some kind of something that I'm not getting here when he talks about you're weak and you're sick. And finally, not long ago, I was studying this, and I really was thinking about it. And he was talking about spiritual things. Spiritual things. And I had an older preacher friend that I love to listen to. And he said, when people don't go to church on a regular basis, when they don't make that the center of their world, Satan comes in and he begins to chip away, and spiritually you begin to erode. And that's so true. I can't remember the number of times that I've missed Sunday morning worship. Probably in the last, well, since I've been in the church, I probably haven't missed over 1 or 2 times per year, and most of the time not that, because I want to be there. I need to be there. I need that strength. I need that spiritual encouragement. And so Paul is saying, you wonder why you're spiritually ill? You don't ever go to church. I'll use our words. You don't ever go to church. You're weak spiritually. Devil's beating you up. Wonder why? You don't go to church. You wonder why you can't get it all put together. You feel like God's letting you down. The problem is you don't go to church. That's what he's saying to me. I might be wrong. I might be overstating it, but that's what I think that he's saying. I don't know of any other way that you can explain it besides that. And then he says, and many sleep. And he wasn't talking about dying physically. He was talking about dying spiritually. When I've talked to people that aren't Christians particularly, and about the need for going to church, and I used to, when I lived in Graham, and we had when the time I left up there, we had about 150 or 160 members in our congregation. Well, every Monday, I would sit down, we had a roll like what we keep here, and I would see who wasn't there. And I would call and check on them, and then I would go and see a lot of them. And if they hadn't been there for several Sundays, and I would go to see them, invariably, almost invariably, I would hear the same thing. Well, preacher, we ain't quit. And I never said it. I wanted to say it. When you do, would you call me and let me know? Because I'm not going to know how to tell otherwise. You know, you're not there 3 out of 4 Sundays and you haven't quit. What's your definition of quitting? And I understand that there are things that happen. We have sicknesses. Shiloh was sick this morning, and so her mom and dad won't be here. They're with her. I understand that. But when we intentionally decide we're not going to go because we don't want to go or we have other things we have to do, and I understand that. I understand those things. But that's what Paul was saying. Many of you sleep. You've reached the point where it's not just a spiritual nap, it's spiritual death. And I think it's important to understand that. And then he said in verse 31, for we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. You know, it's it's almost easier to let somebody else judge you. and sometimes the judgments aren't very accurate, but they're probably more accurate than what they are when we judge ourselves, because we all hold ourselves in pretty high esteem. But you know, if you've ever prayed this prayer, and I have before, Lord, I don't want to see myself as looking through someone else's eyes. I want to see myself as looking through your eyes. And that's scary. It's scary. You just think about that for a little bit. Doesn't matter what Jason thinks about me. I love Jason. He's one of my kids. But what really matters is how God sees me through his eyes. Because the standard that he's going to compare me to is not somebody else in this world, but to his son. And so I need to look at myself like that. And so Paul says in verse 32, when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord. And so when God looks at us and he sees us through his eyes, he sees those mistakes. It's just like with a child. I raised 2 boys. They both were great men, but we spent a lot of time in the woodshed when they were growing up because I wanted them to be the men that they are today. He said, when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord. And I want to be chastened. Yesterday when I was, Sherry's AC went out, and we had to get manned. By the way, if you ever need an emergency AC repairman on the weekend, they're good. And we have other companies that we've used, but they came out, the guy came out, he was there within an hour or so and fixed it, and instead of her house being 88, it's probably 63, I don't know.
It's 79.
79, okay. But, you know, when we're chastened by the Lord, he looks at us and he says, okay, this is what needs to be straightened out. And he says, so that we may not be condemned, with the world. And so, you know, I'd rather be standing when that final judgment comes. I'd rather be standing. God says, okay, I'm going to do the separation. Sheep are going to go on my one hand, the goats are going to go on my other. I want to be in that sheep bunch. I don't want to be in that goat bunch. And so that chastening allows us to be in the proper group, because he says that we may not be condemned with the world. The devil is probably the greatest ad guy that the world will ever know and ever has known. When I watch the news every morning, and I get so sick and tired of, if you want to sell your house, call Mark Spain. I'm sick of that. I don't wanna listen to that junk. I just wanna hear the news. Well, when the world is judged, it's gonna be condemned because it's unworthy of eternity in heaven. And so Paul says that we may not be condemned with the world. We're in the world, but not of the world, and that's the way we should be. And so anyway, when he finishes that chapter, and he talked about when you come together to eat, and he said, wait for one another. Another one of the things that I've heard over the years, the things that's caused division in churches of Christ, is this idea that you're not to eat in the building. Oh, I've gone through that so many times. One of the first things that I usually point out to these people is they didn't have church buildings back then. I don't know any place in history, any place in the Bible, anywhere that says they had a church building. Now sometimes they would meet in the temple that the Jews in Jerusalem did. I'm sure that there were other places, common meeting places they met, but they didn't have a church building. It's the same thing I was talking about the other day when I kept reading this deal about the church treasury. They didn't have a church treasury. They didn't elect somebody to be the handler of the money and pay the bills. They didn't do that type of thing back then. It was done in a different way. There might have been somebody that was, well, they didn't have to worry about electric bill, did they? Or paint, they didn't have to worry about it. So they didn't have those types of things. That wasn't important to them. The thing that they used the money for was to take care of the widows and the orphans. And they might have had someone in charge of that. But anyway, it says, when you come together, wait for one another. If anyone's hungry, let him eat at home. And so this idea, well, you can't eat in the church building, that was not even a concept for them back then. I don't think that they ate in their houses, because I don't imagine anybody had a house big enough, but they could. But the whole idea was it wasn't location, it was what they were there for, and their attitudes and their hearts. And so he says, when you come together for judgment, lest you come together for judgment. So in other words, they had this, to me, what I've envisioned, and you can look at these scriptures so you can figure it out for yourself. I envisioned that these people coming from different places, they came together and met in a common location. I don't know where that was, and I know no one else does. Might have been under the shade tree, but they came together, and Paul says, let's not be of the attitude where we're going to all dive in and start eating and ignoring everybody else. He said, come together, have the right spirit and the right attitude. You can have your meal. If you're hungry, so hungry you can't wait, then go home, whether you go home and eat. It was all about attitude. And when people start taking these scriptures and making laws and rules out of them and create division, they're lost. They're lost. I think that a lot of these things would not apply to us today in the way they did back then, but a lot of these concepts still, I think, would work. Paul says, this last verse, I think about this verse with my dad, and the rest I will set in order when I come. My dad was a truck driver in the latter years of my life, and so he would have conversations with my mother. My mother would pass on the conversation to me, and basically the message was, Mom, you take care of it, and what's left, what needs to be tended to, I'll take care of that when I get home. And I think that's kind of the way it was with Paul, this place here. Thank y'all.